Well, there's a growing need for venture capital and private equity to fuel the development of the private sector in Africa. Despite some challenges in this type of funding, it can be instrumental in helping SMEs grow. And joining us to chat about this further is Michelle Essomé. She's CEO of African Venture Capital Association. Thanks so much, Michelle, for joining us this afternoon. Well, let's start off with the status of private equity as you see it in Africa right now. What kind of activity we're seeing in this arena and the kind of role you see it playing on the African continent?
I think it's probably one of the most exciting times in the history of Africa because you have this domestically driven growth and you have all of these factors, for example, consumers becoming more affluent, and that's creating opportunities in financial services and consumer products. So it's really fantastic, particularly when you have kind of the rest of the world that's not delivering to the same extent as Africa. Mm-hmm. You know, what that means for private equity as an industry, it's still relatively young if you look at Europe or the US, but it's increasingly becoming more professionalized and institutionalized and gaining the eyes of global investors from around the world.
Michelle, you say that AVCA is a trade association dedicated exclusively to representing the private equity and venture capital industries. What role do you play? I mean, how involved are you, and what does that representation that I've just described, what form does it take?
Oh, thank you for that question. Effectively, we're a trade association promoting, I'll say on a macro scale, Africa and private sector in Africa. Specifically, we market what we call investors investing in private companies in Africa. So we've been around, as I said, for about 10 years, founded in Cameroon. And I guess how we execute on our mandate is providing research, because global investors need hard facts about Africa. You know, how many fund managers there are, which sectors are investment, you know, agriculture, infrastructure, consumer, you know, at what price can deals be done. So really that's our role, is to close the knowledge gap and do what we can to attract, you know, global capital from the rest of the world.
Of course, Africa cannot be seen as this homogenous entity. You know, we always talk about Africa as this umbrella, and it isn't. I mean, there are various countries that make up this continent, with each holding their own set of dynamics. Are there countries that really stand out on the radar screen at this point?
Yeah, I mean, you're absolutely right. I mean, Africa is incredibly diverse, 54 countries, different jurisdictions, languages, histories, and many different private equity opportunities. And that's part of our role to, you know, kind of deconstruct and help people understand that it's really fantastic from an investor standpoint, and really the time is now to come look at Africa. So, you know, it's an ongoing challenge, and I say, you know, whenever you're working in Africa, you're selling the whole continent, even though your role may be, you know, relatively specific.
Michelle, you mentioned a phrase which I scribbled down here. It says one of your roles is to close the knowledge gap. When you first started in the business and first started looking at private equity and venture capital in Africa and telling the world about Africa and the opportunities that exist here, how big was that knowledge gap?
I still think it's an ongoing process. Which is good because you get an opportunity to influence, but I think in some ways it's still a bit of an uphill battle. I think we're encountering a lot of media images, and it's going to take some time. From the standpoint of the private equity industry, it's, as I said, relatively nascent, so 15 to 20 years old, but really good signs. So, you know, those investors who are our members are making money and returning money to investors, and making investments that have developmental impact, so job creation, wealth creation, you know, allowing people to send their kids to school, and kind of that circular impact. So the fantastic thing about the industry, and the fantastic thing really about AVCA and my job, is, you know, we get to sell a story that's backed by so many positive elements.
Michelle, just very quickly, I mean, on the flip side of that, just how recognized, you know, is this funding as a finance vehicle on the continent from what you've seen, and just how open are Africans in terms of willingness to open up their businesses to private equity investors?
Yeah, real excellent question. As a funding vehicle for entrepreneurs, that's something we need to do, because there's something like 200,000 private companies on the continent of Africa, and private equity can be be a catalytic form of equity to help transform what I say is a good company to a great one. So that's something that AFCA needs to work on. And to answer your question earlier about kind of knowledge gap, I think, as I said, getting out the message about what are the opportunities in the continent, giving investors raw facts and data to help them make the investments, to make the commitment is really what AFCA's association is focused on.